No one was prepared for what happened that night. Not the journalists waiting outside, not the religious leaders watching in silence through the corridors, and certainly not the faithful who, hours later, would try to understand what had really been decided behind those closed doors. Everything seemed to be following a predictable script, an investigation, a meeting, maybe a formal warning. But what happened was different. It was direct, it was fast, and for many, it felt frighteningly final. 7 names, 7 decisions, 7 doors closing almost at the same time. The impact was immediate. Within hours, the news crossed borders, reached distant countries, and began to stir strong reactions. Some felt relief, as if something that needed to be corrected had finally been confronted. Others felt fear, as if that decision had opened a wound they didn't yet know how to heal. And there were also those who stayed silent, trying to grasp what it all meant for the future. But the most curious detail wasn't the expulsion itself, it was what happened next. Because when the final statement was released and the corridors began to empty, something strange started to unfold. There was no celebration, no sense of victory, none of that feeling of mission accomplished that usually follows tough decisions. Instead, the atmosphere grew heavier, quieter, more watchful, as if everyone was waiting for something that still hadn't been revealed. That early morning, while the city slept and the lights went out one by one, a few rooms stayed lit longer than usual. Conversations continued in hushed tones. Footsteps echoed through hallways that, at that hour, were normally empty, and people who rarely showed concern began looking around with caution, because deep down everyone knew that decision wasn't just administrative, it was symbolic, it was a signal, and signals like that rarely appear without consequences. In the days that followed, the world kept talking about the 7 cardinals, about the accusations, about the courage behind the decision, about the political and religious impact of that moment. But inside the walls where it all happened, the focus shifted to something else, to subtle changes, to actions being reconsidered, to behaviors that suddenly no longer seemed acceptable. It was as if an invisible line had been drawn, and no one wanted to be the next to cross it. Some people started acting differently. Others began speaking less. Decisions that once took weeks were now made in hours. Rules that had been ignored were suddenly followed with precision, and little by little, a quiet feeling began to spread, not of punishment, but of warning. Because everyone understood one thing at the same time. That hadn't been just an expulsion. It had been a message, and messages like that don't end the moment they're announced. They keep echoing, they change behavior, they reshape routines, they make people rethink choices that once felt safe. That's exactly what started to happen. That night, when the doors were closed and the names were announced, many believed the story had reached its end, that the most dramatic chapter had already been written, that the most tense moment had already passed. But in truth, everything was only beginning, because what shocked the world wasn't just the fact that 7 cardinals had been removed in a single decision. The real impact came later, when it became clear that this action had triggered something bigger, something that didn't appear in official statements, something that couldn't be captured in headlines. Something invisible had begun to move inside the church, and very few people noticed it at first. The expulsion was only the beginning, and maybe that's why so many people kept following every detail of that story in the days that followed, trying to understand what was really happening behind the silence and the quiet changes that were beginning to appear. When something that big takes place, you almost feel a natural urge to look closer, to stay alert, like you sense there are still missing pieces in the puzzle. And it's interesting, because anyone who's here right now, listening to this story up to this point, is probably feeling that same thing. That sense that something bigger is slowly being revealed, something that can't be understood all at once, but has to be followed step by step, with attention, with patience, almost like walking alongside the events as they unfold. Because the truth is, that decision didn't end when the names were announced. It kept spreading quietly, changing behavior, awakening awareness, and setting the stage for something that, at that moment, was still about to happen. In the days that followed that decision, something began to change in a way that was almost impossible to notice at first. It wasn't a loud reaction. It wasn't an outburst. It wasn't a public confrontation. It was the opposite. It was a silence that slowly spread, like a fog rolling into a place without asking permission, and the people inside felt it before anyone on the outside did. The corridors that were once filled with firm conversations and confident footsteps grew emptier. Voices became softer. Doors started closing more carefully. And the looks changed first. People who once spoke with certainty began glancing around before saying a word, as if every sentence now carried weight, as if every gesture could be interpreted in a different way. There was no celebration, and that was what frightened people the most, because when a tough decision is made, there's usually some kind of reaction, a sigh of relief, a feeling that something has finally been resolved, but not there. No one celebrated, no one embraced, no one said the mission was accomplished. What settled in instead was a heavy, quiet atmosphere, almost reverent, as if everyone understood that this wasn't the end, it was the beginning, and that beginning brought questions. Questions no one dared to ask out loud. That week, meetings that normally lasted just a few minutes began stretching into hours. Documents were reviewed more carefully. Signatures that used to be given quickly were now examined line by line, not because anyone had ordered it, but because something inside people had changed. It was as if a collective awareness had suddenly awakened, and that shift started showing up in the small details. An employee who was always late began arriving early. A leader who used to decide alone started asking for input before acting. People who once ignored the rules began following them with almost absolute precision, not out of fear of immediate punishment, but out of fear of being the next person questioned. And that kind of fear doesn't make noise, it creates silence. A silence that feels heavy, a silence that makes someone think twice before acting, a silence that turns ordinary behavior into carefully calculated decisions. There were reports of conversations being cut off mid-sentence, people who started speaking, then suddenly stopped, as if they realized they were saying more than they should. There were moments when the sound of footsteps echoing down the hallway seemed too loud, even when no one else was speaking, and little by little that silence began to reveal something even deeper. It wasn't just caution, it was reflection. People who had spent years doing things the same way started asking themselves whether that way still made sense. Those who once felt untouchable began to realize they weren't, and leaders who believed they had complete control started to understand there were limits that could no longer be ignored. That was the moment many people finally grasped the true impact of that decision. It hadn't just removed 7 men, it had changed the behavior of everyone else, and it happened without speeches, without threats, without formal orders. Just one clear gesture, an invisible line, had been drawn, and now everyone knew it was there. There were nights when the lights stayed on much later than usual, people reviewing old files, re-examining past decisions, trying to understand whether, at some point, they had crossed that line without realizing it. And that feeling began spreading beyond the walls where it all started. It reached private conversations. It reached personal reflection. It reached conscience. Because when someone witnesses a firm decision being made, something shifts inside. It's not just the fear of making a mistake. It's the desire to get things right. It's the need to act with greater responsibility. It's the realization that certain choices carry consequences, and that those consequences can arrive when you least expect them. And that's exactly what began to happen. The atmosphere grew quieter, more alert, more serious, as if everyone was listening for something that still hadn't been said, as if the silence itself was preparing the ground for a greater revelation, because deep down no one truly believed it was over. There was a growing sense that that decision was only the first step, that something was still being watched, that something was still being evaluated, that more changes could come at any moment. And that's where the story becomes even more unsettling, because the silence didn't appear by accident. It appeared because there was something people had started to avoid, something no one wanted to face directly, something being kept away from public conversations. If silence had taken over that place, then the question that began echoing in many minds became impossible to ignore. What exactly was being avoided? And before we move forward, let me ask you something simple, almost like a quiet reflection between you and me. If you had been in that environment, sensing that silent shift, feeling that weight in the air, maybe you would have paused for a moment too. And if this feeling stirred something inside you in any way, write a short, honest phrase down below, like someone sharing a personal thought. This moved me. That's when something even more unexpected began to happen. Not in the main rooms, not in the newspaper headlines, and not in the interviews trying to explain what had taken place. What started to change was beyond the reach of the cameras, far from public statements, hidden inside quiet decisions no one announced, but everyone noticed. It was an invisible effect, and at the same time, impossible to ignore. In the days that followed, some people began rethinking old habits without anyone asking them to. Rules that had once been treated as minor details were now followed with almost reverent attention. Small behaviors that had been considered normal for years suddenly felt uncomfortable, not because anyone had been directly punished, but because something inside people had begun to wake up, a kind of awareness. There were leaders who suddenly chose to review projects that were already set for approval. Others requested internal audits they had never considered necessary before. Some called unexpected meetings not to discuss strategy, but to reflect on decisions made months earlier. And interestingly, no one publicly explained the reason behind these changes, but everyone knew the decision that removed those 7 men had created a new standard, a new boundary, a new kind of responsibility, and it began to spread like a quiet echo. In one office, a document was reviewed 3 times before being signed. In another, a leader apologized for an old mistake that had never been acknowledged. In a discreet meeting, someone stopped mid-sentence and said something few expected to hear. Maybe we ignored warning signs that were right in front of us. It wasn't fear, it was awareness. It was as if, all of a sudden, people realized that some decisions aren't just administrative. They're moral. They reveal who we truly are when no one is watching. And that realization changed the atmosphere in a deep way, almost silently, but completely irreversible. Because when a firm decision is made, it doesn't just affect the people directly involved. It affects everyone who was paying attention. And that's exactly what happened. Some began quietly wondering whether they had been complacent at some point. Others started remembering situations where they could have acted differently. There were people who stayed up later than usual, reviewing old reports, trying to find answers to questions they had never asked before. And little by little, something began to take shape. An internal shift, a change that couldn't be measured in numbers, recorded in reports, or announced in official statements. It was a shift in attitude, a shift in mindset, a shift in awareness, and that was far more powerful than any punishment, because punishment scares people, but awareness transforms them. There were reports of leaders visiting departments they had never stepped into before. People who had spent years delegating decisions began following processes closely. Others sought spiritual guidance, not out of obligation, but out of necessity, as if something inside them was asking for direction, asking for clarity, asking for truth. And the most striking part is that none of this was ordered. None of it was imposed. None of it was demanded. It simply happened, like a natural response to a moment that exposed a reality many had preferred not to see. And that was when some people finally realized the true scale of that decision. It hadn't been just an act of discipline. It had been a mirror that forced each person to look at themselves. And for many, that was harder than any punishment. Because facing your own conscience takes courage. It takes humility, it takes honesty. And little by little, that truth began showing up in unexpected places, in private conversations, in quiet meetings, in personal reflections made in the stillness of the early morning. People who never showed doubt began asking questions. People who always seemed confident started seeking guidance. And leaders who once felt unshakable began acting with a new kind of caution, almost reverent. It was as if everyone understood something at the same time. This hadn't been just a correction. It had been a call to responsibility, a call to integrity, a call to awareness. And that created an effect no one had predicted. It didn't tear down structures. It didn't spark revolts. It didn't create chaos. It created transformation, a quiet transformation, deep, and in many cases, painful. Because changing on the inside means facing truths that have been hidden for a long time. But even with all these changes unfolding, one question kept growing stronger with each passing day. If it wasn't fear of punishment that caused this transformation, then what was it? What exactly awakened such a deep change inside people? Before we move forward to what happened next, let me invite you to reflect with me for a moment, because maybe you've lived through something similar. Maybe you've seen a firm decision change the behavior of everyone around you, not because of fear, but because of awareness. And if at some point in your life you felt that kind of quiet awakening, Write a simple phrase down below, almost like sharing a personal thought. This changed the way I see things, because what happened there was still far from over, and the next step would reveal something even deeper. And that was exactly the moment when something even more delicate began to unfold. It wasn't an explosion of accusations. It wasn't a flood of complaints. It wasn't a public scandal. It was quieter than that, and because of that, far more profound. Little by little, stories began to surface. Small at first, almost hesitant, like whispers moving through a crowded room, making everyone turn their heads at the same time. First, there was a quiet comment during a closed-door meeting. Someone mentioned an old procedure that might need to be reviewed. Nothing dramatic, nothing urgent, just an observation. But that observation lingered in the air, like a question no one had dared to ask before. Then, more reports began to appear. A leader decided to revisit old contracts. A supervisor asked to review files that had been sitting in drawers for years. An employee, for the first time, questioned a practice that had always been accepted as normal. And suddenly, what once felt routine started to feel strange, uncomfortable, hard to justify. It was as if a light had been turned on in a dark room, and when the light comes on, everything changes. Things that were once hidden become visible, details that were ignored begin to stand out, and actions that seemed small start revealing deeper meaning. That's exactly what began to happen, not in a dramatic way, but in a steady way, quiet, persistent. Some people began remembering decisions made in the past and felt a new weight in their chest, not because someone accused them, not because someone threatened them, but because in the face of this new reality, they themselves started to realize that certain behaviors weren't as harmless as they once seemed. There were moments when meetings ended earlier than planned, not because there was nothing left to discuss, but because there was too much to think about. Conversations that used to be quick became careful. Words that once came easily were now chosen with caution, and slowly a feeling began to grow among everyone, a feeling of responsibility, and alongside it, an undeniable sense of truth. Not the kind of truth found in official documents or public statements, but the kind of truth that rises from within your own conscience, the kind that makes you pause for a moment, take a deep breath, and wonder whether you could have acted differently. That was when the first confessions began to appear. Not public confessions, not emotional speeches in front of crowds, but private conversations, quiet acknowledgements, admitting mistakes to a small circle of people in silent rooms, far from any spotlight. And that changed the atmosphere for good, because when someone admits a mistake, even in silence, something shifts. The air feels different. The environment becomes more honest, more transparent, more real. And that movement began to spread like ripples across a calm lake. An act of courage here, a responsible decision there, a different attitude somewhere else. And suddenly what had once been tolerated started to be questioned. Old practices that had survived for years without challenge began to be examined with a critical eye. Procedures that had been repeated automatically started to be discussed, and mistakes that were once considered inevitable began to be seen as unacceptable, not because someone forced it, but because awareness had changed. And when awareness changes, the standard changes with it. That was the moment when many people realized something that had once been invisible. The removal of those 7 men hadn't just corrected a specific situation. It had exposed something that had been hidden for a long time, a system of habits, decisions, and quiet permissions that had slowly become part of everyday routine. And now, for the first time, those things were being seen clearly. It was uncomfortable, it was painful, but it was necessary, because truth has that kind of power. It doesn't arrive shouting, it arrives shining a light. And when that light shines, it doesn't just reveal the mistake, it changes the standard of what is acceptable. What was once ignored becomes unacceptable. What was once tolerated gets corrected. And what once seemed normal starts to look like a warning sign. That's exactly what began to happen. The focus shifted away from the people who had left and moved toward the changes that remained. Conversations were no longer about the names of those who had been removed. They were about the actions that needed to change. The concern was no longer about the past. It was about the future, about the kind of environment that was being built from that moment forward. And that shift in focus was decisive, because when it happened, the question stopped being who was removed and became what was being transformed. That question began echoing through every decision, every meeting, every quiet reflection at the end of the day. And the more people thought about it, the more they realized that this story was still far from over. Something bigger was beginning to take shape, something deeper, something that couldn't be ignored. And maybe you've lived through a moment like that too, a moment when a truth appeared unexpectedly and changed the way you saw everything around you, a moment when it became clear that certain things could no longer stay the same. If you've ever felt something like that in your life, write a simple phrase down below, almost like sharing an honest thought. This changed the way I see things. Because what started to emerge there wasn't just an isolated truth, it was the beginning of a transformation that was still about to reveal its deepest impact. That was when a deeper understanding began to emerge. It didn't come from a speech, an official announcement, or a public statement. It came from a quiet realization, almost personal, that slowly started to take shape inside people. Little by little, many began to see that the decision made that night wasn't just about individuals, it wasn't just about names, it wasn't just about positions, it was about something much bigger. Because as the dust began to settle and conversations became more reflective, one question started circulating among those who were watching closely. What had truly been removed that night? What actually left that place when the doors were closed and the 7 men stepped away from their roles? The answer didn't come right away. It revealed itself slowly, like a truth that needs time to be understood. First, someone pointed out that certain behaviors were no longer being tolerated. Then another noticed that decisions once made without question now required justification. And as the days went by, it became clear that something invisible had been removed along with those men. A mindset, a way of acting, a silent habit that had settled in over the years. It was as if, for a long time, small compromises had been made. Small permissions, small deviations that seemed harmless at first, but over time created an environment where certain actions began to feel normal. Not because they were right, but because no one had found the courage to break that cycle. Until that night. And that was exactly what changed everything. It wasn't the departure of the men that caused the transformation. It was the message that remained afterward. The message that there were limits that could no longer be ignored. That there were principles that could no longer be negotiated. That certain practices, no matter how old they were, no longer had a place in that environment. That realization began to change everyone's behavior. People who once stayed silent started speaking with more conviction. Leaders who avoided confrontation began facing difficult situations with renewed courage. Employees who felt uncertain began acting with greater confidence, not because they were forced to, but because they understood that something essential had been redefined. The standard had changed. And when the standard changes, everything around it has to adjust. There were meetings where decisions were stopped at the last minute. Not because of technical errors, but because of moral awareness. There were conversations where someone raised a hand and said something needed to be reconsidered. There were moments when people chose the harder path simply because they knew it was the right one, and that began to shape a new culture. A culture built on responsibility, on transparency, on courage, but above all on truth. That was when many people finally understood the true meaning of that decision. It wasn't an isolated act. It wasn't an impulsive reaction. It was a turning point, a line that separated what was acceptable from what was no longer allowed, a moment that made it clear the institution was willing to confront its own mistakes in order to protect what mattered most. And that brought a different kind of feeling. It wasn't fear. It was respect. Respect for the values being defended. Respect for the courage to act when it would have been easier to stay silent. Respect for the decision to break a cycle that could have continued for years if no one had stepped forward. Because deep down everyone knew that choice hadn't been simple. Making a decision like that requires more than authority. It requires conviction. It requires awareness. It requires the willingness to face criticism, resistance, and doubt. And, above all, it requires the courage to do what is right, even when it means facing difficult consequences. And that's exactly what happened. That night, 7 men left their positions. But what truly left was something much deeper. The idea that certain mistakes could be ignored left with them. The belief that some practices were unavoidable left with them. The silence that had allowed problems to grow for years without being confronted left with them. And in its place, something new began to rise. A collective awareness, a new way of looking at one's own actions, a genuine willingness to act with integrity, even when no one is watching. That was the real impact of that decision. And maybe that's why, even today, many people still talk about that moment with a mix of respect and reflection. Because it wasn't just an administrative episode, it was a shift in direction, a powerful reminder that institutions are made up of people and that people can choose to act with courage when the high moment demands it. And if you stop to think about it, maybe you've lived through something similar at some point in your life, a moment when someone made a difficult but necessary decision, a moment when it became clear that certain things simply couldn't continue the same way. If that feeling resonates with you too, maybe it's worth leaving that thought here below in a simple way, like someone sharing an honest reflection. This decision isn't easy, because the story that began that night is still echoing, and what came next showed that the change was only just beginning. And maybe the most striking part of this entire story is realizing that deep change almost never happens all at once. It begins quietly, inside people, in small decisions, in choices that seem simple, but over time they end up transforming everything around them. If you've made it this far, following every detail and reflecting on each moment, it's because this story touched something inside you too. A memory, a feeling, or maybe even a question that's still echoing in your mind. And that's exactly why this space becomes more than just a place for stories. It becomes a place for reflection, for learning, for walking this path together. People who observe, who think, who want to understand what lies behind difficult decisions and the moments that change the direction of everything. If this journey meant something to you, then it might be worth staying close and following the next steps of this story. Because it didn't end here. There's another video right beside this one that goes even deeper into this theme, and it may reveal something that brings together everything you just felt right now.